204 years ago, a family of German settlers built this East Tennessee frontier homestead. In 1791, Nicholas and Mary Gibbs left Orange County, North Carolina with 10 of their children. The youngest was 2, the oldest 25, and they all survived a perilous 450-mile trek climbing across the Appalachian Mountain Range and through the Cumberland Mountains.
Well, I've always wondered what motivated a man in his late 50s, after 25 years of establishing a home, to uproot his family and plunge into what was for European settlers the remote frontier.
I think it was just adventure. Adventure.
He apparently was the kind of person that things didn't go so soon, packed up and moved. So he wasn't a timid individual.
Like so many of these settlers, they apparently wanted elbow room. Of course, we've always heard that about Daniel Boone, who said that he wanted to move on because there were too many people around. They wanted elbow room. And land was wealth. This is where they had most of their wealth, was in the property they owned. So you'd say, well, maybe I'm only getting a tract as large as I had in North Carolina, but there's always a good chance that I can buy additional property for a very, very good price.
Back in 1787, the governor of North Carolina removed Nicholas Gibbs from consideration for a post in the government. So maybe he craved social status and thought he would have a better chance to achieve it as a big fish in a little pond. By moving to the frontier, he could obtain status as a founder of a community.
He helped to found the Lutheran Church on Millertown Pike.
And he was named Justice of the Peace in 1794. It is interesting to speculate whether Nicholas's motivation was social status, adventure, privacy, wealth, or some combination of these factors. But we can move beyond conjecture with regard to certain customs, attitudes, priorities, and practices of the Gibbs family. We have this ability partly because of our access to a major cultural artifact, the Gibbs original frontier homestead. Born around 1736 in the village of Krumbach, Nicholas Gibbs emigrated from the German state of Rhineland-Palatinate and arrived in Philadelphia in 1754. He fought for England in the 7 Years' War, after which he spent some time in Maryland, and then sometime prior to 1764, he traveled to a German enclave in Orange County, North Carolina. There he married Mary Efland, who was a third-generation German-American. Mary and Nicholas spent 25 years establishing a family of 13 children in this German-American community before leaving for present-day East Tennessee. The Gibbs family certainly considered themselves American, but the question is, while living in this house, did they retain any German cultural distinctions, or were they completely assimilated into the dominant European culture of the Southern Appalachians, the Scotch-Irish? 200 years after the family's arrival, this question was addressed. In 1990, anthropologist Dr. Charles Faulkner established at the Gibbs homestead the University of Tennessee's first archaeological field school. For the next 4 years, he would lead students on an archaeological dig of the site.
Well, we were hoping to find evidence of German ethnicity. For example, especially architectural features.
In the 18th century, most German-American farmsteads were found in the Shenandoah Valley, and particularly in south-central and southern Pennsylvania, where the Pennsylvania Dutch, who were actually German, settled. There are distinct differences between this farmstead tradition and the upland south pattern that is typically found in the Scotch-Irish influenced southern Appalachians.
Characteristics of an upland farmstead include what appears to be a random scattering of buildings over the landscape. Actually, they're not randomly scattered, but they appear that way because they have to essentially fit buildings into the rather rugged topography that we have here. The Germans, for example, would have, even if there had been a slope, they would have put a building there, they would have dug the building into the slope, they would have made a bank building or something like this. I mean, they were very adamant about making use of space very, very efficiently and doing it in a very traditional manner.
Even individual farm buildings were perceived differently by the two ethnic groups.
Buildings are used for a multiplicity of purposes, unlike German farms, for example, where they had very specific buildings for specific purposes. In an upland south farm, although you might have a smokehouse and a barn and these kinds of buildings, they could switch functions here. One building could sometimes serve several different purposes or several different functions. They weren't quite as rigid here in terms of the way the buildings were used. I was hoping that we might find, say, the foundation of some kind of a special building that had been used by the Germans, such as a dry house or some kind of a bank building or something like that. There certainly were German settlers that came to this area, but they seem to have been isolated families. And if the Gibbs farmstead is any indication, it seems that they very quickly adopted an upland South or a Southern Appalachian pattern here, rather than trying to stick to the German type of farm tradition.
The log home construction method used by Nicholas Gibbs also represents an abandonment of German-American traditions. Notice his use of half-dovetailed corner notches.
This is very typical for the Southern Appalachian area, especially among Scotch-Irish and English settlers. The Germans made a full dovetail, corner timbering or corner notching.
However, Dr. Faulkner's team did uncover evidence of German ethnicity, and unexpectedly they found it in the cookware and tableware artifacts buried on the site. The surprise was that they discovered a significantly higher percentage of redware than amounts found on area Anglo-American frontier sites, and the high use of redware is considered particularly German.
I wasn't sure what we would find in terms of things like tableware and those kinds of artifacts. The amount of redware, in some cases, in some of our excavations, as much as 30 or 40% of the ceramics was lead-glazed redware, which is a very, very significant amount, considering the fact that on other late 18th and early 19th century sites like the James White house site, the Ramsey house and so forth, redware only constitutes something like maybe 10, 15%, something like that. So that was significant. The other significant thing too was the fact that a lot of the redware was tableware. It wasn't utilitarian. It was actually used on the table, plates and cups and bowls and things like this. They were actually setting the table with it, which again is quite German-like.
Of course, we can also look to some sources outside of this family's material culture to reflect their heritage. For example, a Bible written in German had been found in the Lutheran church they helped establish. And there is some written evidence that German remained Nicholas's primary language throughout his life. In the final analysis, it appears that the family maintained elements of their German identity while assimilating at the same time.
The Gibbs family, up to the time they left the farm, were what you would call, what we call middling farmers, yeoman farmers, subsistence farmers. They were eking out a living, so to speak, from the land, eating most of what they grew. We know they sold some of their crops. They, of course, had to obtain things that they couldn't raise themselves, like sugar, salt, coffee, these kinds of things. And during that time, it was almost all done by bartering. They may have had bees. They may have traded beeswax, furs or skins.
And they certainly ate the meat of any animals whose skins provided them with barter currency. But the popular image of buckskin-clad homesteaders hunting game for most of their meat is contrasted by the following excerpt from a master's thesis study of over 3,000 faunal remains found on the Gibbs site. Although a fair amount of native species were incorporated into the Gibbs family diet, around 90% of the meat came from domestic livestock, pigs, cattle, and chickens. The most important species of wild game were turkeys, deer, and rabbits, all species that might have been attracted to the homestead's fields of grain and thus could be hunted with a minimum amount of effort.
I think the Gibbs tried to live as comfortably as they could, given their circumstances, which again, they were subsistence farmers, they were yeoman farmers. They set a fairly nice table. We know they had more than one tea set. This is a saucer. It's pearlware, which was made in England from 1780 to about 1820, although this particular piece was probably made and used in the 1790s. We know this because it was found in a cellar under the smokehouse, which dates from that time period. The decorative technique is called underglazed blue hand painted, and it's got a Chinese design, which was very common at that time. This is one of at least two or more tea sets that Nicholas Gibbs's wife was using when they first settled on the property. Apparently a family clock was owned, which was brought over the mountains. I would imagine that they were one of the few families in Knox County at that time that had that type of clock.
These refined items might have given the Gibbs a sense of genteel status, or an elegant escape from their long and arduous workaday existence. A fine tea set and an intricately made clock were also connections to the civilization they left on the other side of the mountains. But their priorities stretched well beyond material goods and were rooted in the present.
Of course, the community was extremely important in the late 18th and even through the 19th century to these people, because this is where they obtained all their help. For example, when they built the house, everybody came over and they had a house raising. If someone was ill, they would come and take care of them. Would minister to them. If they had any kind of calamity at all, people would bring in food. If someone got ill or someone was hurt, they would come in and help them harvest their crops or do the work on the farm or anything like this. And it was reciprocal, of course. I think it was community-wide in terms of the very close relationships that they had with one another. Not only as neighbors, but also through their church, I did, because most of them had very, very strong faith in God. I mean, obviously they had to, since there were all these dangers and other kinds of things that could befall them. You know, they had to have some kind of a faith here, I think, to carry them on. And I think the church was very, very important in terms of community existence.
Ich sage dir Lob und Dank, o Herr Gott, himmlischer Vater, der du mich diesen Tag und die ganze Zeit meines Lebens so gnädiglich behütet und mir so viel und große Wohltaten erzeiget hast.
People today don't have to depend on each other. I mean, you can get along very, very well even out in the country because you have an automobile, you have a doctor that you can see. There are stores nearby where you can buy your food. I mean, you can get along without ever speaking to your neighbor or ever having anything to do with members of the community at all. 100 years ago, 150 years ago, this just simply wasn't the case. I mean, you could not survive, probably. I mean, very difficult probably in the long run for you to survive if you did not have that kind of community support. And many elderly people, I think, in our society today bemoan the fact that, gee, you know, we don't know our neighbors anymore. Our neighbors aren't friendly anymore. They don't come and neighbor with me anymore. I don't know who they are. I've had these people living next door to me for 5 years and I still don't know their name. But that's modern society. Of course, they also had usually the support of relatives as well. You know, the relatives were probably the major support if there were a number of relatives around, and very often there was an extended family. Certainly there wasn't the case of the Gibbs.
I told my grandmother, who was living at the time, that she was kin to my grandfather. And of course, she didn't believe me, and I got in big trouble over it. But when I showed her the book and it was traced down, then she said, well, it's a wonder any of us have any sense. Of course, they didn't know it at the time, because years ago, people didn't worry about genealogy like we do now. Most people that were farmers and just made a living and got by, they didn't travel probably more than 50 miles from their home in their entire lives. And they just naturally married maybe a third or fourth or fifth cousin, come down a generation on each side, and never thought anything about it. But I don't think that's just happened around here, but probably everywhere.
Today, of course, an extended family in rural America is more the exception than the norm. Economic, technological, and societal forces combined have contributed to this century's mass exodus from the family farm.
I think that by the end of the 19th century, many of these already small farms had been divided up so much that there simply was not enough land left to grow crops or keep stock that could be sold on a cash economy. And of course, by this time, certainly by the mid to late 19th century, we're also dealing with a cash economy. People had to acquire cash in order to obtain the things that they wanted, and they just simply could not do that anymore.
Up until her death in 1992, Mrs. Ethel Brown was the last living descendant of Mary and Nicholas Gibbs, who had been born at and was a primary resident of the Homestead. This is a photo of her and her family taken around 1910 at the Homestead. Her father, John Luther Gibbs, inherited the homestead from his father, Rufus, who inherited it from his father, Daniel, who was Nicholas and Mary's youngest son and Mrs. Brown's great-grandfather. 5 contiguous generations lived and made a living here from 1792 until 1910. Soon after this picture was taken, Ethel Brown, who was 10, and her family moved to Knoxville.
I recall Mrs. Brown telling me that one reason they moved into town was because it was more convenient. I think there were the modern conveniences there which they just simply did not have out on the farm.
Direct descendant Fern Whited has lived within a few miles of the homestead her entire life.
I grew up long enough ago that we did not have electricity out this far out of town, and I know the inconveniences you had with that.
Nicholas and Mary's son, Nicholas Jr., was killed during the War of 1812 at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Tradition has it that his brother John fought alongside him and returned home with Nicholas Jr.'s soldier's pouch, which contained, amongst other things, the seeds of a Kentucky coffee bean tree. In memory of their fallen son and brother, the family planted the seeds from which a Kentucky coffee tree grew as a living monument.
The original trees that were here are gone. But Mrs. Brown told me, who of course lived here as a girl, that her grandfather, Rufus, that's right, when the mail, he would go out down the driveway here, and one of the trees had a hollow place down in it, and he would sit inside that tree and wait for the mailman to come by if it was raining, and then he'd go get the mail. That was on the upper side of the driveway, but all of those trees are gone. But many of the coffee trees are still here, of course, younger generations of them. And they come up all the time. That's why they've been here so long. I'm satisfied that they're still here, because they come up from the roots. Just you put one out and they'll sprout up everywhere.
It is unlikely the Gibbs family imagined that scores of years later, Nicholas Jr.'s nephew, Rufus Gibbs, would have a practical use for the tree. But it would be even more incredible to think that they realized the symbolic power that their memorial planting would generate for descendants almost 2 centuries later. The Kentucky coffee bean tree is a misnomer. It doesn't bear coffee beans. But on this homestead it bears more essential fruit, the fruit of knowledge. It is a living link between the past, present, and future, a perfect correlative to the descendants of Mary and Nicholas Gibbs and other human beings whose efforts produce an awareness of our diverse American cultures.